The house stood still, like it always did. A modern fortress of steel and glass perched above the cliffs, its architecture bold, expensive, and impersonal. Inside, silence reigned. It had for years. No footsteps echoed in the halls. No laughter spilled from the rooms. No warmth lingered in the walls. Only the distant rhythm of the waves below kept time with Elliot Raines's steady, solitary life. He was a man used to silence. He had learned to coexist with it after the accident, after the hospital room emptied, after the condolences stopped. People called it a tragedy. He called it a turning point. He had everything: money, influence, legacy, but lost the only things that mattered. His wife, Lila, pregnant with their first child, had died on a rainy night more than a decade ago. Since then, he'd stopped letting the world in. That evening had begun like all others. A glass of whiskey by the window, a leather-bound book left unopened on his lap, lights dimmed to his preferred hue, a soft amber that cast long shadows on the stone floor. The fire crackled, the wind sighed against the tall panes of glass, and then it came, the sound that didn't belong, a faint cry. Elliot froze. He waited, unsure whether it had come from inside or out. For a moment, he thought it was his mind playing tricks, echoing some long-suppressed memory. But then it came again, sharper, real, fragile and urgent. He stood, heart quickening. The cry was faint but persistent, carried on the night breeze. He followed it through the house, down the corridor, through the kitchen, to the door that led into the garage. He hesitated. That door had barely been opened in years. His cars sat untouched, their engines cold. But tonight, something was different. He unlatched the door. Cold air brushed his face as he stepped into the darkness and flicked on the lights. There, in the corner, beside the rear tire of his old Bentley, was a cardboard box, a large one. Nestled inside were blankets and movement. He moved slowly, afraid of what he'd find. As he knelt beside the box, his breath caught. 3 tiny newborn girls, crying, faces red and fists clenched, wrapped tightly in mismatched blankets. Their eyes squeezed shut, their mouths open wide with need, and they were alone. He stared, disbelieving. His first instinct was disbelief. This couldn't be real. Someone must be coming back for them. There had to be a camera crew waiting outside, some twisted prank. But the cries were real. The cold was real. The fear in his chest was real. He reached into the box. His hand trembled as he touched one of the girls, who immediately gripped his finger with impossible strength. That single touch undid something inside him. It collapsed the walls he had spent years building. He didn't understand it fully, but in that moment, he knew one thing: he couldn't leave them there. He gathered them carefully, one by one, bringing the box inside and setting it gently in the living room, where the fire still burned. The warmth washed over them. Their cries softened. He had no formula, no crib, no experience. He hadn't held a child since his wife's funeral. And yet, here he was, kneeling on the rug, facing 3 tiny lives placed into his hands without warning. He paced the room, phone in hand, thumb hovering over the emergency number. But he didn't dial. He couldn't. Something inside him said to wait, to listen, to feel. And what he felt wasn't fear, but something older, something like love, raw and trembling at the edges of his grief. He didn't sleep that night. He fed them warm milk from teaspoons, held them in turns, let their cries fill the rooms that had known only silence. When dawn broke, his home felt different, not just louder, alive. And Elliot Raines, the man the world had forgotten, sat beside the fire with three newborn girls asleep against his chest, wondering if, perhaps, this wasn't a coincidence at all. It was the first time in years he had looked toward the future and not felt afraid. Morning light spilled gently across the living room floor, softening the sharp edges of stone and steel. The mansion, once austere and echoing, now held a quiet hum, shallow breaths, tiny sighs, the rustle of blankets. Elliot hadn't moved from the couch in hours. One baby lay against his chest. The other two nestled beside him in a makeshift bed of pillows and towels. The fire had burned low. His eyes were heavy, but he stayed awake, unwilling to miss a moment of their fragile presence. He didn't know their names. He didn't know where they had come from, but they were here now, and somehow that felt like enough. Still, reality pressed at the edges of the moment. He knew the questions were coming. Who would abandon newborns in a garage? Why his home? Why him? He looked at the girls so small, so vulnerable, so utterly dependent. Calling the authorities was the logical step. It was the responsible thing to do. But as he reached for the phone again, something inside him recoiled. The thought of strangers arriving, taking them away, filing reports, placing them into a system, it made his stomach turn. He knew how systems worked. They were efficient, impersonal, and rarely kind. He stood slowly, his back aching from hours in one position. One of the girls whimpered. He paused, gently rocked her in his arms. It soothed her instantly. The ease of it surprised him. He hadn't held anyone like this since Lila. The kitchen felt foreign as he rummaged through drawers for something, anything that might help. He found a measuring cup, a soft cloth, an old hot water bottle. Improvised warmth, improvised care. He heated milk, tested it on his wrist like he remembered seeing in movies. His movements were clumsy, but his focus was absolute. There was no time to overthink. When he looked in the mirror above the sink, he didn't recognize himself. His hair was tousled, shirt wrinkled, eyes tired but alert. There was something else, something rare. Purpose. By late morning, he made a list. Diapers, bottles, formula, blankets. He had never stepped inside a grocery store since his wife passed. Everything had been delivered, scheduled, automated. But now, he would have to go, leave the house, face people, explain nothing. Before he left, he stood over the sleeping babies, hesitant. He didn't want to leave them alone, even for a moment. Eventually, he bundled them into a large wicker basket lined with towels and took them with him. The drive into town was quiet, surreal. The town hadn't changed much in 10 years, but to Elliot, it felt new. He parked near the back entrance of a modest corner pharmacy and carried the basket inside. The clerk, a young woman with kind eyes, looked up and blinked. "Triplets?" she asked, wide-eyed. He didn't answer, just nodded and handed her his handwritten list. She said nothing else. She helped him, no judgment, no questions. When he returned home, the sun was beginning to lower in the sky. He fed them, changed them as best he could, wrapped them in soft new blankets, and held them close until they slept. Later that night, he sat alone in his study. The door cracked open so he could hear them breathe. His hands trembled as he reached for the drawer where he kept old photographs. He hadn't opened it in years. Inside was a picture of Lila, radiant and smiling, her pregnant belly just beginning to show. He stared at it, heart breaking all over again. "I'm sorry I disappeared," he whispered, "but they're here now." The house was still imperfect. He didn't have all the answers, but something had shifted. He wasn't just a bystander in his life anymore. He had made a choice not out of obligation, but something deeper. He wouldn't call the authorities. Not yet. These girls had been abandoned at his doorstep. Yes, but that wasn't the end of the story. Maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning. The days that followed were a blur of unfamiliar rhythms, feeding schedules that never aligned, diapers changed by trial and error, cries that came in waves, urgent, unexplained, relentless. Elliot moved through it all with the quiet intensity of a man rediscovering purpose. He made mistakes. He mixed formula too hot. He put a diaper on backwards. One night, he fell asleep sitting up with two of the girls in his arms and woke in a panic, heart pounding, convinced he had harmed them. But each time he doubted himself. They reminded him in the simplest ways how one stopped crying the moment he picked her up, how another reached out mid-sleep and grasped his finger, how their breathing slowed when he hummed low, broken melodies into the dark. He started calling them by nicknames: Rose, for the tiniest one with the loudest cry; Lily, for the quiet one who watched him with wide, still eyes; and June, the one who smiled in her sleep, even when nothing else made sense. It wasn't official, it wasn't permanent, but names made them real, personal, his. Mornings were hardest. He used to wake to silence, to nothingness. Now he woke to soft murmurs and stirrings, the rustle of blankets, the rising warmth of 3 new lives. He'd forgotten how morning light could make a room feel alive. He'd forgotten what it was to be needed. On the 5th day, he sat at the kitchen table, a baby in each arm, the third in a carrier at his feet. Bottles lined the counter. The scent of formula hung in the air. A lullaby played softly on the old radio. He hadn't planned any of this. And yet, as he looked down at the sleeping girls, a thought came to him, not one born of logic, but of quiet conviction. He loved them, not just a vague affection, not just the tenderness of proximity, but love the kind that pierced through the armor he had worn for years, the kind that terrified him, precisely because it meant he had something to lose again. He didn't know how long he would have them, whether someone would show up one day with answers. A mother, the law. He didn't know if he was doing anything right, but he knew they were his responsibility now, not just for tonight or until someone knocked on the door. As long as they needed him, he would stay. He began keeping a journal, not for himself, but for them. Each night after they were asleep, he wrote down what had happened, how Lily had gripped his sweater all day, how June had refused to nap unless rocked in the armchair, how Rose had smiled, really smiled for the first time. "I don't know if I'm doing this right," he wrote, "but I'm trying. For you. For all of you." The house began to change. Rooms long untouched were cleaned out and aired. He cleared a guest bedroom and turned it into a nursery, painting the walls a soft, pale yellow. He ordered cribs and toys, soft lamps, stuffed animals. Every box that arrived at the gate was carried in with a strange mixture of determination and disbelief. It felt like building a life he never expected to have, and with each small step, a part of him healed. Not all at once. Grief doesn't vanish, it weaves itself into the new fabric. But Elliot found himself laughing, sometimes out loud, startled by the sound of it. He found himself speaking again, narrating his day to the girls as if they understood every word. He found himself hoping. One night, long after the babies had fallen asleep, Elliot stood alone at the window. Rain tapped gently against the glass, mirroring the night they had arrived. He didn't know why they had been left here. He didn't know what the future held. But he felt something unfamiliar stir within him, a flicker of trust, not in the world, not in fate, but in the quiet, mysterious way life gives second chances without asking for permission. And Elliot Raines, the man who had shut the door on life long ago, stood in his warm, lived-in home and whispered, "I'm glad you came." The nursery smelled of talcum powder and lavender, warmed by the soft glow of the new nightlight Elliot had installed by hand. The room was quiet now, three tiny chests rising and falling in unison, cradled in freshly assembled cribs. It was the first time in a week that all three girls had slept at the same time. The silence was different now, not empty, but earned. Elliot sat just outside the room, on the hallway floor, his back resting against the wall. He should have been exhausted. His body ached from days of lifting, pacing, rocking, but fatigue wasn't what kept him there. It was something deeper, something stirring. He stared at the nursery door, the soft yellow paint, the handmade name cards pinned above each crib: Rose, Lily, June. His handwriting was shaky, but the names had felt right, familiar, almost as if the girls had brought pieces of themselves with them, and he was only now learning how to listen. The house had changed, but Elliot knew change came with consequence. And that night, the past returned not as a sharp blow, but as a slow, suffocating tide. He stood and walked downstairs, poured himself a glass of water, then stood in the kitchen without drinking. His eyes drifted to the corner cabinet, the one he never opened. He hesitated, then reached for the key. Inside were remnants of another life: Lila's journals, baby clothes she had ordered, an unopened letter addressed to their unborn daughter. Elliot pulled the box from the shelf and carried it to the table. He opened the lid slowly. There it was, a pair of tiny shoes, pale pink, wrapped in tissue paper, a pacifier she had chosen during their last trip together, and the ultrasound photo, grainy, black and white, but unmistakably theirs. Elliot gripped the edges of the box as the memories surged. He remembered the night they lost her, the way the hospital lights burned his eyes, the quiet way Lila's hand slipped from his, the silence that followed, the unbearable stillness of returning to a home that had been waiting for a child who never came. He had shut that door and never opened it again. Until now. He reached for the journal and opened to a random page. "She kicks every night now. I think she recognizes your voice. I hope she gets your calmness, your quiet heart. I hope she knows she's already loved." The words hit him like a wave. He didn't cry. Not yet. He simply sat there, reading in silence, the journal in one hand and the sound of the rain returning in the background. Later, unable to sleep, he stood at the doorway of the nursery again, watching the girls. He tried to picture what Lila would say if she could see him now, holding bottles, changing diapers, mumbling lullabies in the middle of the night. Not just surviving, but trying. That word echoed trying. He didn't know what he believed about fate, or grace, or second chances. But standing there, something inside him softened. Maybe this wasn't punishment. Maybe it wasn't coincidence. Maybe these girls weren't here to remind him of what he'd lost, but to show him what was still possible. He whispered her name. Lila. The room stayed still, but something lifted. Elliot didn't sleep that night, but for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. The ghosts had come, yes, but not to haunt him. They had come to witness, to remind him of who he once was, and who he might still become. The next morning brought a different kind of weariness, not just from sleepless nights or aching joints, but from something heavier, the awareness that he couldn't do this alone. Elliot had always prided himself on self-sufficiency. After Lila's death, he'd built a life where no one could enter and no one could disappoint him. Now, three newborns had turned that world inside out, and he found himself needing what he had long avoided other people. He sat at the kitchen table, feeding June with practiced care, her tiny fingers curled around the edge of the bottle. Lily and Rose slept in slings across his chest, a solution he'd discovered through a desperate late-night internet search. The exhaustion was manageable, the logistics, barely, but what unsettled him most was the unknown. Were the girls healthy? Were they developing as they should? What if he missed something? What if, despite all his effort, it wasn't enough? He made the call just before noon. It took him 15 minutes to dial the number. Ruth Connors, he asked when the line picked up. Yes, who's speaking? My name is Elliot Raines, he said, his voice uneven. We met years ago. You worked with the home care unit at Mercy Hospital. My wife Lila was under your care in her last trimester. There was a pause. I remember, Ruth said, her tone softening. I'm very sorry for your loss, Mr. Raines. Thank you. I need help. He told her only part of the truth, that he had come into unexpected care of three newborns and didn't trust his instincts. He didn't explain the garage or the crying night or the unopened mystery of how they had come to him. Ruth didn't press. Within 2 hours, she was at the house. Elliot watched from the doorway as she moved through the nursery with quiet authority, checking temperatures, inspecting eyes and joints and bellies, cooing gently as she worked. The girls responded to her without fear. They're in good shape, she said after the exams. A bit underweight, but that's common. They've bonded with you. That's obvious. They have names now, Elliot said, almost shyly. Rose, Lily, June. Ruth smiled. Beautiful. Did you choose those, I think? They chose them. She stayed longer than expected. After the assessments, they sat at the kitchen table, and for the first time in years, Elliot offered someone coffee in his home. They were left in my garage. He finally admitted, I don't know who they belong to. I didn't want to call the authorities right away. Do you want to keep them, she asked. He didn't answer immediately. I don't want them taken. That's not the same thing. He looked at her. I know. She nodded. Then we start small. I'll come by every other day. Help monitor their health. Teach you what you need to know. And if at any point you change your mind about any of it, we'll talk. But for now, they're safe. You're doing better than most would. He walked her to the door. Before she left, she looked at him and said quietly, Lila would be proud. She always said you had more kindness in you than you believed. Elliot closed the door behind her and leaned his forehead against it, eyes shut. Something in him cracked gently this time. Not the violent kind of grief that had broken him before. This was quieter, humbling, a slow loosening. That night, he lit a candle in the windowsill. A small gesture. Lila used to do it every time she wanted to feel close to something larger than herself. She called it her anchor light. The girls slept well, each in their own crib, each in their own soft blanket, and Elliot sat in the armchair beside them, journal in his lap, writing down every small detail, not just what had happened, but what it had felt like. The fear, the gratitude, the strange emerging sense that these children weren't just saving his life. They were rebuilding it, piece by piece, day by day. And now, he was letting others in to help carry the weight. For the first time, that didn't feel like weakness. It felt like the beginning of something real. By the second week, the town began to notice. It started with small things a man like Elliot Raines, long absent from public life, suddenly appearing in the aisles of the pharmacy with diapers and formula stacked high in his cart. The cashier at the grocery store spotted 3 infant car seats buckled neatly in the back of his black SUV. A delivery driver mentioned hearing crying when he dropped off a bulk order of baby wipes at the gate. In a place like Willowmere, where little changed and people still read the local bulletin board, curiosity spread fast. No one confronted him directly. Not yet. But eyes lingered longer at the cafe when his name came up. Conversations paused when his car passed. The story grew in the spaces between facts, stitched together by imagination and old memories of a man who had once hosted charity galas and holiday dinners and then disappeared. Elliot didn't pay much attention at first. His world was measured in feedings and naps, not headlines or hearsay, but Ruth noticed. One afternoon, after checking in on the girls, she sat him down at the kitchen table. "People are asking questions," she said gently. "Some are curious. Some are concerned." He nodded slowly. "I assumed as much. You can't stay invisible forever, Elliot. Not with 3 babies. I'm not trying to hide. He exhaled. "I didn't plan any of this. I don't owe them an explanation." "No," Ruth agreed, "but you may need their grace, and that takes trust." He didn't respond. Later that evening, as he rocked June to sleep, Elliot found himself staring out the front window. Beyond the gates, the road curled into town like a ribbon of memory. He thought about the people he once knew, the friends who drifted away after Lila died, the ones who reached out but were quietly turned away. He had built this silence himself, and now it no longer protected him. It isolated him from the world his girls would one day grow into. The next morning, he made a decision. He drove into town with all 3 girls and stopped at the church. The building stood simple and tall, sunlight pouring through the stained glass and soft streaks of gold and blue. He hadn't stepped inside since Lila's funeral, but something about it felt right, not religious, exactly, but human, humble, open. He waited until service ended, then approached the woman organizing donation bins in the side hall. She turned at the sound of the stroller wheels. Her eyes widened. "Mr. Raines." Elliot nodded, his voice low. "I need some help." Her name was Marla Jennings, volunteer coordinator, retired teacher, and longtime fixture of the community. Within minutes, she had the babies in her arms, cooing at them with practiced ease. She didn't ask too many questions. She simply listened. "I'm not asking for charity," Elliot said, watching her rock Lily gently. "Just guidance. I don't know what I'm doing." Marla smiled without judgment. "No one does it first. That's why we don't raise children alone." She made a few phone calls. By that afternoon, a basket of donated baby clothes arrived. A local mother offered to bring home-cooked meals once a week. An older man named Pete, a retired carpenter, volunteered to help build a playpen and baby-proof the house. And just like that, the walls began to shift, not physically but emotionally. People who once kept their distance now leaned in, not out of gossip, but out of something purer: community. Elliot didn't say much, but he thanked them all with quiet sincerity. Every visit, every casserole left at the door, every set of knitted booties delivered with a handwritten note, he accepted it not as charity, but as connection. That night, he sat on the porch, listening to the soft hum of crickets and the distant sound of laughter from a neighbor's yard. Inside, the girls slept, full and warm. He opened his journal. "The world hasn't changed, but maybe I have. I thought I needed to be invisible to survive, but these girls, they need to be seen, and to raise them, I have to be seen too." He paused, then wrote one more line. "Maybe healing isn't something you do alone. The whispers in town didn't stop, but they changed. Curiosity gave way to quiet admiration. And behind the gossip, something else began to grow: respect for the man who was learning, in full view of the world, what it meant to love again. The days began to take on shape, not routine. Exactly life with 3 infants allowed for little predictability, but rhythm. Feedings, diaper changes, naps, soothing cries and shifts. The quiet triumph of one baby sleeping through the night. Elliot had stopped checking the clock. Time was no longer something to fill, but something to hold carefully, moment by moment. Each girl began to show signs of her budding personality. Rose was still the loudest, quick to protest, quick to giggle. Lily remained observant, calm, a quiet anchor who studied every new face with a look of deep curiosity. And June was the connector. She reached for her sisters in her sleep. She smiled when Elliot entered the room. She hummed before she cried, as if trying to explain her feelings before expressing them. Elliot found himself responding to their cues with surprising instinct. He knew which cry belonged to which girl now. He could cradle them in one arm and answer emails with the other. His days no longer revolved around avoidance or grief. They revolved around care, but there were still gaps, things he couldn't learn from books or intuition. It was Marla who suggested he meet a woman named Cora. She's got 2 kids of her own, she explained over the phone. One's a toddler, one's in school. Her situation isn't easy, but she's solid, practical, kind, and she understands what it's like to do it alone. They met at the church hall on a Tuesday afternoon. Cora was in her late 20s, with strong arms, tired eyes, and a kind of groundedness that came from weathering storms and surviving them. She wore no makeup, spoke with clarity, and carried her youngest on her hip while handing her oldest a snack with practiced grace. Elliot arrived with a diaper bag slung awkwardly over his shoulder, the twins in a double stroller, June cradled in a wrap. He felt like a student among masters. "You're braver than most," Cora said after their introductions. "Or more desperate." "Probably both," Elliot admitted. They talked while the babies slept in their carriers. Cora didn't pry. She asked about formula preferences, sleep cycles, colic signs. She gave advice without condescension and listened without judgment. When Rose started to fuss, she scooped her up and bounced her gently, speaking in a low rhythm that quieted the baby instantly. "You've got good instincts," she said, "but instincts aren't everything. Sometimes you just need someone to say, 'Yes, this is hard. Yes, you're doing enough.'" Elliot felt something shift, not in the way it had when Ruth first arrived, or when Marla offered help. This was different. Cora wasn't offering sympathy. She was offering partnership and equal stepping into the chaos without hesitation. Over the following weeks, their lives began to overlap. Cora stopped by the house on weekends. She showed him how to make pureed vegetables from scratch, how to treat diaper rash with oatmeal baths, how to breathe through the exhaustion instead of resenting it. In return, Elliot offered her quiet space, meals, and someone who would listen without trying to fix everything. She told him about her past briefly, without dramatics, a partner who left, a shelter she once called home, the struggle of living paycheck to paycheck while raising 2 children alone. "You ever wonder why people leave?" she asked one evening as they sat on the back porch, both holding sleeping babies. "Why some people run from the very thing that gives them meaning?" Elliot didn't answer right away. He looked at June, whose fingers were curled around his shirt. Then he said quietly, "Because sometimes meaning feels like too much to carry." Cora looked at him and nodded. And yet, here we are, that night, after she left. Elliot found himself looking at the nursery with different eyes, not as a man filling silence, not as a wounded soul seeking redemption, but as part of something bigger, a fragile, forming circle of people bound not by blood, but by choice. The girls stirred. Elliot leaned over to soothe them, brushing their foreheads with the back of his fingers. They had changed everything. Not with grand revelations or miracles, but with daily, ordinary need. And through their need, Elliot found something he hadn't dared hope for in years: belonging. Not just for them, but for himself. The girls had been in Elliot's care for just over a month when the first letter arrived. No return address, just his name, typed neatly on the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, brief, impersonal, official. Mr. Raines, we've received a report regarding the presence of 3 unidentified infants at your residence. A case officer will be assigned to verify their welfare and determine the legal circumstances of their custody. Expect contact within the week. Child Welfare Services. Elliot stared at the words, hands still, heart rising slowly into his throat. It had always been a question of when, not if. He had made a choice the night he found them to love them first, to protect them before explaining them. But now the outside world was catching up, and the world had rules. He folded the letter carefully and slid it into a drawer. Then he walked to the nursery, where June was babbling softly to herself, feet kicking the air. Rose slept with a stuffed elephant tucked under her chin, and Lily lay awake, staring at the ceiling, as still and alert as ever. He sat beside her crib. "I don't know what's going to happen," he whispered, "but I promise whatever comes, I won't disappear this time." The next day he called Ruth. She came by before noon, her face lined with quiet worry as he handed her the letter. "They'll want details," she said after reading. "Birth certificates, medical records, chain of custody. You don't have any of that, do you know?" Elliot said. "All I have is the truth. The truth might not be enough." He nodded. "Then I'll find more." Together, they began tracing threads. Ruth filed a temporary guardianship petition, an act that didn't promise permanence, but offered legal breathing room. Elliot contacted a lawyer, a quiet man named Harris who had helped him once with estate paperwork. Harris, surprised but intrigued, agreed to assist without questions, at least for now. Meanwhile, Marla reached out to a friend who worked in family services. Cora offered to help research local hospitals for anonymous births or abandoned infants. And Elliot did what he had avoided. Until then, he reviewed the security footage from the night the girls arrived. The video was grainy, but clear enough. A small sedan pulled up just before midnight. The driver got out slim, hurried, wearing a hoodie. She carried the box gently, looked around, and placed it beside the garage door. Before leaving, she hesitated, placing something small on top of the blanket. Then she climbed back into the car and drove away. Elliot froze the image. He couldn't see her face, not fully, but there was something in the posture young, overwhelmed, not careless, but desperate. He replayed the moment when she placed the object in the box, zoomed in, a pendant, silver, small. Later that night, while feeding Lily, he remembered the item. It had been wrapped inside one of the baby blankets, something he'd tucked away in a drawer without much thought. He found it now worn and cool in his hand. The pendant was shaped like a crescent moon, with initials carved faintly on the back, A.L. He showed it to Cora the next day. "That's custom," she said, turning it over. "Might be traceable." So they traced it. A few phone calls, a few dead ends, and then a breakthrough. A small jewelry shop 2 towns over recognized the piece. They'd made it last year. The buyer had paid in cash, but left a note for engraving. The name on the slip, Amelia Lane. Cora and Elliot exchanged a glance. It wasn't much, but it was something. Back home. He stood at the window long after the girls had fallen asleep. The wind was rising, clouds thickening beyond the hills, storm weather. He didn't know who Amelia Lane was. He didn't know if she'd come back, or why she'd left them, or if he was strong enough to face what she might bring. But what he did know was this: he wasn't running. Not now. Not again. He had stepped into their story, and he wasn't going to leave it unfinished. The storm broke just after midnight. Rain lashed against the windows, and thunder rolled across the hills like a warning. Elliot stood in the nursery doorway, watching the three girls sleep through the noise. It amazed him how easily they trusted the world, how deeply they surrendered to rest, even when the world outside was chaotic. They had no idea what was coming, no idea how close everything had come to unraveling. That morning, he received a phone call from Harris, the lawyer. "We found her," Harris said simply. "Amelia Lane, 19 years old, lives in a halfway house in Eastbrook. She disappeared from the foster system a year ago. I've already contacted her caseworker." Elliot said nothing for a moment. The name Amelia sounded strange in his ears, like something pulled from a dream he'd forgotten to finish. "Is she coming here?" he asked. "She wants to meet you. She asked about the girls." Elliot's chest tightened. "When tomorrow?" He hung up and stood in the center of the living room, still holding the phone in one hand. He expected fear, but what he felt was more complicated. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even anxiety. It was grief, rising again in a different form. A reminder that these girls, Rose, Lily, and June, had a past that did not begin with him. The next afternoon, Amelia arrived. She stepped out of a rusted blue sedan, clutching the sleeves of an oversized jacket, her face pale and drawn. She looked even younger than her age, fragile, like someone who'd spent too long learning how to survive and not enough time learning how to live. Elliot met her at the gate. They stood in silence for a long moment before he spoke. "You left them with care." Her voice was quiet, barely audible. "I didn't want to, but I couldn't. I didn't know what else to do." He led her inside. The girls were asleep in the nursery. Amelia stood at the doorway, hands trembling as she looked at them. Her breath caught at the sight of them, three tiny lives, whole and safe and wrapped in soft light. "I didn't know I was having triplets," she said finally. "They told me it was just one, then maybe two. I didn't have anyone. No job, no place. The system lost track of me. I was scared. And then suddenly I had three babies in my arms and no idea how to feed them." She looked at Elliot then. "I remembered your house. I used to walk past it as a kid. It looked safe, like a place that wouldn't forget them." Elliot didn't know what to say. He hadn't expected to feel compassion, not this quickly. But there it was, raw and sudden. She wasn't reckless. She was abandoned, left without choices, without guidance, and somehow, even in her desperation, she had chosen love, not for herself, but for them. "They're okay," he said. "They're loved." "I can see that," she whispered. They talked for over an hour about the pregnancy, about the day she left them, about the empty space she had carried every day since. Amelia didn't ask for them back. She didn't try to prove anything. She only asked one question. "Can I see them? When you think it's right?" Elliot nodded slowly. "Not today, but maybe someday soon." Amelia smiled small, aching. "That's enough." Before she left, she turned to him at the door. "You saved them," she said. "And I know what that cost." "No," Elliot replied, his voice low. "They saved me." She walked back to the car without looking back. As she drove away, the sky began to clear. The storm had passed. The house stood quiet again. That night, Elliot sat by the cribs and watched the girls breathe. He didn't feel ownership over them. Not possession. What he felt was something deeper, a guardianship, a responsibility to honor the pain that had brought them here and to protect the hope they carried now. He opened the journal and wrote one line: "Her story doesn't erase mine, and mine doesn't erase hers, but somewhere in between, a new one is being written, one we all belong to." And in the stillness of that night, with 3 babies sleeping peacefully beside him, Elliot Raines finally understood that this wasn't just a beginning anymore. It was a life. The house had settled into a new kind of stillness, no longer heavy with loss, but filled with breath, memory, and motion. Morning sunlight spilled across the nursery floor, catching the edges of toys, soft blankets, and the worn rocking chair Elliot now claimed as his own. He sat there with June cradled against his chest, watching Rose pull at the edge of a soft book while Lily stared at her reflection in a baby-safe mirror. They had grown visibly, tangibly. Their cheeks were rounder, their eyes more alert. They were beginning to laugh, to grip toys with purpose, to recognize each other's presence. More than once, Elliot caught them reaching for each other in sleep. The bond between them was instinctual, effortless. He often wondered if, despite everything, some part of them remembered being carried into the world together. He was not the same man who had found them crying in a box. He no longer feared the morning or measured the day by what he'd lost. His world no longer ended with his own pain. It had cracked open, and through that crack, life had returned. Still, the letter from Child Welfare Services lingered in the back of his mind. Temporary guardianship was just that, temporary. There would be a hearing, a decision. The girls had no official last name, no birth certificates, no formal path to permanence. They were still, in the eyes of the law, unplaced. Elliot met with Harris at a quiet cafe on the edge of town. The lawyer brought documents this time. "You've done everything right," Harris said, flipping through the thick folder. "You've had health officials monitor their development. You've accepted help. You've remained transparent with the system. And Amelia, she signed a declaration of voluntary relinquishment. No coercion, no pressure. She's also requesting a clause that allows for future contact if it's in the girl's best interest." Elliot folded his hands on the table. "She deserves that." "She does," Harris agreed. "So do you. But if you want to make this official, really official, it's time to give them a name." Elliot froze, not because he hadn't thought of it, but because he had, quietly, in the background of every bottle, every bath, every lullaby. He had whispered their names 100 times, but never all at once, never on paper. "They're already my daughters," he said quietly. The paperwork would just make the world catch up. That afternoon, back at home, he sat at the desk in the study where Lila once wrote poetry and lesson plans. He filled out the documents slowly, carefully. First names, middle names, then the last Raines. Rose Marin Raines, Lily Isabel Raines, June Alora Raines. He chose each name with care, stitching together memories, meaning, and hope. Marin had been his grandmother's name. Isabel was Lila's middle name. Elora meant light of God, something he never would have chosen years ago. But now it felt right. He printed the papers, signed them, sealed them. That evening, he gathered the girls into the nursery. Ruth, Marla, and Cora arrived, all carrying small gift books, blankets, handwritten notes for the day they're old enough to read them. No one said much. They simply sat on the floor and held the girl, laughing softly, grateful. Then Elliot stood. "I don't know how this happened," he said. voice steady but filled with emotion. And I still don't have all the answers. But these three girls, they're not just guests in my life anymore. They are my family, not because of blood, but because of love, because of choice. He turned to the girls, kneeling so they could see him. You were left with nothing but each other. Now, you'll have everything I can give. A name, a home, a father. The room was silent except for a small coo from June, followed by a spontaneous laugh from Rose. Everyone smiled. Later that night, once the house was quiet again, Elliot wrote in the journal, "A name is more than a word. It's a promise. I've given them mine, not to erase where they came from, but to mark where they're going and where they'll never be alone again." The candle in the window burned brighter that night, not as an anchor, but as a beacon, a signal to whatever came next. They were no longer just surviving. They were becoming something whole, something lasting, a family. The weeks that followed moved like chapters in a book Elliot never imagined he'd write. There were moments of joy so quiet they would have gone unnoticed by his former self. June falling asleep with her cheek pressed against his palm. Lily laughing for the first time at the sound of running water. Rose clapping wildly at her own sneeze. Each girl now had her own crib, her own favorite toy, her own rhythm. And Elliot, once a man defined by silence and solitude, had become fluent in their language, half spoken, half felt. He could interpret their cries like a seasoned musician reading sheet music. He knew when to rock, when to hum, when to simply sit beside them and be. He no longer flinched at the sound of a baby monitor. He no longer needed a clock to know it was time for feeding. His movements had become automatic, his patience deeper, his attention more precise. His world had narrowed, and yet, in its narrowing, it had expanded beyond anything he had known. One morning, he carried all three girls outside into the garden. The air was crisp and golden with late autumn sun, leaves scattered like confetti across the path. He laid down a thick blanket beneath the old sycamore tree and set them there gently. They squealed, reaching for the sky, the air, the wind. It was their first time sitting on earth instead of being carried above it. Elliot knelt beside them and watched. His heart was full, but not with the swelling ache of grief or even the stunned disbelief he'd once carried. This was different. This was fatherhood. Not just the care and duty, but the bond, the presence, the knowing. Later, Ruth dropped by to check on their progress. She watched them for a long time, how they reached for Elliot when he stood, how they looked for him when he left the room. "They know you," she said softly. "Not just your voice or your smell. They know your soul." Elliot nodded. "And I know theirs." She smiled. "The court date is next week. The judge will want to hear you speak, not just the lawyer." Elliot's expression shifted, hesitation crept into his eyes. "I've spent years avoiding rooms like that." "Ruth, I know, but this time, you're not standing there for yourself. You're standing for them." He looked at the girls, now dozing together in the playpen like a pile of sleepy kittens. "I'll be ready." The night before the court hearing, Elliot sat alone in his study with a legal pad and pen. The house was quiet. The girls had settled early, worn out from a day of unexpected visitors, Cora, Marla, even Pete the carpenter, who brought a handcrafted wooden growth chart shaped like a tree. Elliot stared at the blank page for a long time. Then he wrote, "I didn't choose to become a father the usual way. It chose me. It came in the form of a knock I never heard, a box I never expected, and a cry I'll never forget. These girls didn't come from me, but they belong with me, not because I'm perfect, but because I stayed. Because I chose to love them before I had permission, before I had certainty, before I had language for what they would become to me. They are my daughters, and I am their father. He folded the note and placed it in the inside pocket of his coat. He didn't know if he'd read it in court. He didn't need to. What mattered was that it was true. All of it. In a life marked by absence, these girls had made him present. In a world that once felt hollow, they had rooted him in something real. And as he turned off the light and headed up the stairs, he whispered into the quiet, "Tomorrow, I will tell the world who you are to me." The nursery was peaceful when he peeked in. June stirred. Lily sighed in her sleep, and Rose smiled, as if dreaming of something bright. Elliot stood at the doorway, arms crossed, heart full. He had once been a man who lost everything, but now he had something that couldn't be taken. A name, a bond, a reason, a family. Tomorrow, the law would catch up. But tonight, love had already decided. The courthouse was colder than Elliot expected, its gray stone walls humming with quiet tension, the kind only found in buildings where lives are regularly decided. He arrived early, dressed in a dark suit he hadn't worn in years, its sleeves slightly looser now. He carried the girls into the waiting room one by one, their car seats arranged like anchors around him. Cora was already there with her 2 children. Marla followed with Ruth. Even Pete came, jacket neatly pressed, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers. They all waited with him, not out of obligation, but out of something deeper witnessing. At 9:47 a.m., the clerk called his name, Elliot Raines. Petition for legal adoption of minors, Rose Marin, Lily Isabel, and Juna Laura. The courtroom was modest, a wooden bench, a few chairs, a seal of the state hanging above the judge's desk. The girls cooed and stirred as Elliot set their seats gently near the front. The judge, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and kind, sharp eyes, studied the file in front of her. "You understand, Mr. Raines," she began, "that adoption is not merely a legal process, but a declaration of lifelong responsibility." "Yes, Your Honor," he said, voice steady. "And you also understand that these children, who were not born to you, will from this day forward carry your name and your legacy." He glanced at the girls, all 3 now calm and watching him. "They already do," he said. The judge leaned forward slightly. "Do you have anything you wish to say before I finalize the order?" Elliot reached into his coat and unfolded the paper he had written the night before. His hands trembled slightly as he began to read. "I didn't plan to become a father. I didn't plan for anything. Really not after my wife passed. I spent years building walls around my life, convinced that silence and safety were the same thing. But then, one night, I found 3 newborn girls in my garage. Abandoned, yes, but never unloved." He paused. Everyone in the room seemed to be holding their breath. "They taught me how to live again, not by asking anything extraordinary of me, just by needing me. Needing my arms, my voice, my patience. And I discovered in that need a kind of healing I didn't think was possible anymore. These girls have names now. They have a home, but what they need most is not food or shelter. It's a person who will never walk away, and that's what I'm standing here to give them. Not a perfect father, just a present one, a willing one." He folded the page and looked up. "I choose them every day. I choose them." The judge nodded slowly, her expression unreadable at first, then softened by something unmistakable respect. "Then let the record show," she said, raising the stamp, "that Rose Marin Raines, Lily Isabel Raines, and Juna Laura Raines are hereby and fully adopted by Mr. Elliot James Raines Henceforth, in name, law, in spirit, they are his daughters. The stamp hit the paper with a final, echoing thunk. No applause followed, just silence, a sacred one. And then, one by one, those seated began to rise, not ceremonially, but instinctively, as if something holy had passed through the room. Elliot turned to see Ruth wiping away tears, Marla smiling with hands clasped tight, Cora nodding, proud and quiet, and Pete, gruff as ever, simply whispered, "Good man." He bent down, unbuckled each girl from their seat, and lifted them into his arms, all three at once. Somehow, they squirmed and babbled, unaware of the permanence that had just been sealed around them. But Elliot knew. He carried them out of the courthouse, not as a man who had inherited a burden, but as a father who had been given the deepest kind of gift. Outside, the sunlight was waiting, the sky impossibly blue. He stepped onto the sidewalk, each daughter safe against his chest and shoulders, and took his first breath as the man he had become, not the one life had once broken, but the one it had rebuilt. Not a lonely millionaire anymore, not a grieving husband, a father. And for the first time in years, Elliot Raines didn't feel like a man surviving. He felt like a man who had arrived.